Greetings, folks, and welcome to the first part of our unit on Pidgins and Creoles, specifically those Pidgins and Creoles in the so-called New World. We'll be focusing on two for the most part: Jamaican, which will stand as our example of Caribbean Creoles, and Gullah, a Creole spoken by the descendants of American slaves in a narrow band of land along the coast of the Carolinas and northern Georgia. For today's talk, I'm going to give you some background on slavery. That will actually take a fair bit of time. And then we'll take a look at a concrete example of Jamaican Creole and a little bit of grammar, because of course, grammar is always fun. And just to give you fair warning, the next slide I'm going to show you is one of the most disturbing images that I have ever shown a class. But it is also probably our best way into looking at the socio-political economic history of the institution of the transatlantic slave trade. This is the coat of arms of Sir John Hawkins, 16th century slave trader and admiral of the English Navy, who died on a voyage to the Caribbean in 1595. I show you this because it's important to bear in mind that the wealth of many, if not all, of the European colonizing powers was built more on the slave trade than on any other single institution. This was not a matter of shame. It was, as you see, a matter of pride at the time. And if you're simply listening to this rather than watching or looking at the PowerPoints as they go along, the image is of an African man, shirtless, bound in ropes, within a shield. Obviously, the coat of arms highlights the sense of domination that Europeans both felt and enacted towards Sub-Saharan Africans. It also showcases the relatively new invention of the notion of biological race, which was first articulated by the Portuguese as recently as the mid-15th century, and specifically for the purpose of justifying the newly initiated slave trade, in which, to the best of my knowledge, the Portuguese were the first to engage. And now that I have your attention, I think we should maybe talk about some of the economic factors underlying slavery, specifically underlying the transatlantic slave trade. I talked to you a few lectures ago about the triangular trade, but it may be worth refreshing your memories just to have everything present in your minds. Once humans had been reduced to the status of commodities near the dawn of Western modernity, they became, obviously, also cargo. So the triangular trade, as it emerged in the early centuries of the modern period, worked like this. A ship would leave one of the European colonizing powers, we'll say, for example, Liverpool, because ultimately Liverpool ended up being the busiest port in this trade in the world, and it would leave with a boatload full of goods made in the home country, so England for our purposes. It would then sail down to Sub-Saharan Africa, dock at one of the many slave ports that dotted the coast, offload its first cargo, and take on a new cargo of human beings to be sold as slaves in the so-called New World. Then it would sail across the Atlantic, where it would offload its cargo of human beings in, for example, Kingston in Jamaica, and take on a cargo of goods from the colonies to be shipped back to the home country. The most common commodity from Jamaica was sugar. And so it went around and around, ultimately involving the forced transfer of over 10 million people from Sub-Saharan Africa to the Americas, broadly speaking, and also involving the absolute destruction of many African cultures due to the social and economic and political chaos wrought by the sudden demand for people as things. And it's worth remembering that at the dawn of modernity, there were cultures in Sub-Saharan Africa that were in many ways more advanced than anything the so-called West had yet to produce. The slave trade effectively destroyed all of that. And as I mentioned before, once one or two nations got involved in this trade, other nations felt the need to do so as well, or face being outcompeted in the race for both empire and the wealth that came with empire. So numerous arguments, were of course manufactured to justify the pre-decided conclusion that it was okay, and even in some cases right, to pursue the institution of race-based slavery. But of course, I don't mean to insinuate that the transatlantic slave trade was the beginning of slavery. Slavery goes back at least as far as civilization, by which I mean the organization of societies around the institution of the city or city-state. And pretty certainly had its origin sometime after the agricultural revolution. So, sometime in the last 10 or 12,000 years. Hunter-gatherer societies don't tend to have slavery. Agrarian societies do. The innovation involved with the transatlantic slave trade was precisely the innovation of race, or the invention of race, the invention of blackness, if you wish, which of course is a meaningless term without the corresponding invention of whiteness. The notion that there were categorically different groups of human beings, definable by outward traits such as skin color, is of, as I said, very recent origin and utterly without scientific foundation. Previously, words for race and the word race meant something other than what they have come to mean since the slave trade. Even when Darwin, writing The Origin of Species, which of course was published in 1859, refers to races, he's not referring to races in that pseudoscientific sense. He's referring to varieties. He speaks, for example, of races of plants, races of animals, and very clearly treats Homo sapiens as one race. But the pseudoscientific understanding of race, as I said, bases categories on outward appearances. There's often an appeal to genetic differences between the groups, but this has long since been debunked. There is more genetic variation within any of the commonly identified racial groups than there is between them. And there is, in fact, more genetic diversity within a single band of wild-living chimpanzees than is to be found across the entire human population. So, races are unreal. They are objects of discourse, and that is all they are. But because they are politically and economically useful objects of discourse, they persist as if they were real. That is, the concept of race is politically useful and continues to be politically useful, and when it stops being so, it will stop being tossed around, I'm quite sure. But why use slaves in the first place? Well, you don't have to pay them, but you do have to buy them, and that's not cheap. So there has to be a fairly strong economic impetus to engage in purchasing these very pricey commodities in order to make it economically worth your while. One of the reasons, of course, is that while in Europe, poor Europeans could be found to do any number of menial jobs because they had very little choice or opportunity to do otherwise. So while there were slaves in Europe, the population of slaves in Europe never got to be what it was in the Americas. So why not use poor Europeans to work the fields in the Americas? Well, there are a few reasons for that. One, they didn't want to, and they weren't slaves, so you couldn't make them. Two, with all of that land supposedly up for grabs because, well, I guess you can take what you want from the people who were already there. If they didn't like the way they were being treated, they could leave, and did. But then you might ask, okay, well, why bring people over from Africa? Because there were people already here. But of course, there were a couple of complications with that option as well. One, the First Nations people with whom Europeans came into contact tended to not be from agrarian cultures and therefore not to have the relevant skills that were needed for example, the cultivation of sugarcane and another important one, rice. And for another, First Nations people throughout the Americas were not immune to European diseases and therefore tended to die in huge numbers very shortly after first contact. In fact, it's been estimated that as many as 90% of the original inhabitants of the Americas may have died due to smallpox. So the workforce that you could press into labor from the First Nations were lacking in the relevant skills and relatively soon after you came into contact with them, largely dead. As for Sub-Saharan Africans, the situation was completely different because Africa, Asia, and Europe are all pretty much contiguous with each other. Africans were already immune to the same diseases that Europeans were immune to, and therefore could be counted on not to die off in large numbers. Also, many of them came from agrarian cultures and had the skills required for sugarcane cultivation and rice cultivation. And in fact, the price of a slave would vary considerably depending on the skills that that person actually had. Regarding power structures within the slaveholding societies, and particularly power structures that affected the trajectories of language, the situation looked something like this. The slaveholders were, rightly, afraid of an uprising of the people whom they were enslaving. Because, of course, if you are enslaved, you will want to escape, and if the opportunity presents itself, you're probably going to take it. The overseers of the slave populations, therefore, came up with a system to prevent the slaves themselves from communicating with each other and therefore organizing. This system was one of deliberate separation. That is, arriving populations of slaves were broken up such that speakers of the same language were not in contact with each other. So imagine that. You're ripped away from your life. You're shipped across the ocean. You spend the entire journey on a shelf about 18 inches wide. And if you survive the trip, and many didn't, you're hauled off of the boat and deliberately put in groups of people who don't speak the same language as you. So you have no one to talk to, no one to communicate with. This policy left the language of the slaveholders, so for our purposes English, as the only language of communication, a language that the slaveholders had mastery of and that the slaves did not. And of course, as they learned the language, they only learned enough of the language initially to do what they were being told to do. So they weren't included in the overall language community of their new, I hesitate to call it home. What does happen, though, is that in the dialects that develop, in the dialects of English that develop among the enslaved communities, though the vocabulary is predominantly English, a number of grammatical structures survive from the African languages that the initial population had spoken. Now, also, to make things even more impossible for the slaves to organize, at least initially, there was, of course, a very high mortality rate. People were quite regularly worked to death, and these losses would be made up with new arrivals from Africa. So the slave population was fragmented deliberately and, by its very nature, unstable. These two things, to fragment a people and destabilize such community as they have, always work in favor of the people who are in power. Other factors that we might loosely categorize as part of the power structure were enforced illiteracy. That is, slaves were not taught to read. In fact, in many jurisdictions, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read. It was a punishable offense. This was certainly the case in the American South, because, of course, literacy is power. So this enforced illiteracy also, for linguistic purposes, further restricted the vocabulary, for example, and the grammar that would be accessible to the enslaved people. And it's worth pointing out that the majority of churches supported slavery. That is, slavery had the institutional support of the church. This may for many be an uncomfortable fact, but it is a fact. And many of the arguments that the slave-holding societies developed in order to justify the practice, whose root ultimately was economics, were constructed from religious sources. That is, slavery was preached from the pulpit. And when I say slavery was preached from the pulpit, what I mean exactly is this. The pro-slavery arguments coming out of the Bible, and I will go into some of them with you in a moment, are based on a literal reading of the text. Now, you will probably have heard or been told at some point that the majority of people historically have not taken the Bible as a literally true document. While this may be true of theologians, it does not seem to be true of the majority of historical believers. That is, your everyday people who happen to be Christian. For instance, Bishop James Ussher in the 17th century believed he had calculated the actual age of the cosmos by counting back the generations of the Old Testament to Adam, and then counting back from there in days to the first day of creation, which was, by his reckoning, October 22nd, 4004 BC, roundabout tea time. And while this may sound like a quaint and amusing anecdote from the distant past, the copy of the King James Bible that I actually have on my bookshelf, and that was printed in the 1970s, uses Ussher's dates. So, while, for example, a thinker such as Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine would quite rightly say that to be properly understood, much of the Bible has to be read metaphorically, everyday Christians didn't think that way, especially when it served their interests not to. That is, the Bible was interpreted literally, and the logic here is simply that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, and if slavery is endorsed or allowed in many passages in the Bible, and in fact it is, God must endorse or at least allow slavery. Therefore, it is not wrong for people to own other people as property. But don't take my word for it. We'll start with the Old Testament, but we won't be finishing there. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 12, and again in chapter 27, verses 13 through 25, there are instructions for the circumcision of slaves. What is the assumption here? The assumption here is that slaves are taken from foreign populations. Were this not the case, they would already have been circumcised. So while there is certainly a case to be made in the Old Testament for slavery being a limited institution aimed at a debtor working off a debt to the person to whom it is owed, and that certainly is there, debt slavery is not the only kind of slavery in the Old Testament. There is also chattel slavery. That is, the taking and trading of humans as property from peoples other than one's own. And this isn't a passing blip. There's more penis mutilation in Exodus 12:43. But to return to Genesis, in Genesis 37, Joseph is sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. Well, okay, fine. What's the logic here? The logic, of course, is that it was wrong for them to do that. Great. I'm on the same page there as the Genesis authors. There were several. But also, there is an assumption that slavery is bad. That is, it was wrong to sell Joseph into slavery. It was wrong to take a free person and sell him so that he becomes someone else's property. There's an underlying understanding that being someone's property is not the ideal human condition and is one that we tend to try to avoid. But there's more, and let's skip ahead now to Exodus. I want to spend a fair bit of time on Exodus. Exodus chapter 21 describes the institution of slavery in pretty precise detail. And yes, as I said, there is a category of slavery that is debt slavery. A person can either voluntarily or non-voluntarily be placed in servitude to work off a debt that he couldn't otherwise pay. That is, that type of slavery is very much like the institution we refer to as indenture, servitude for a limited time. For instance, we're told in Exodus 21, verse 2, "When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and he bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out a free person, then his master shall bring him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life." That is, while the general practice for Hebrew slaves is a 6-year term, if their master gives them a wife while they are enslaved, they're faced with the choice of going out at the end of their term without their family, or, if they want to stay with their family, remaining in slavery, remaining in servitude. That is a really clever way of manipulating people into remaining one's property, isn't it? Or, if you want to beat a slave within an inch of his or her life, the book of Exodus has got your back. This is book 21, verses 20 to 21. "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives for a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money." That is, you can beat a slave to within an inch of his or her life, or you can even beat them to death as long as they die a lingering death rather than a quick one. And you're in the clear as the slave owner. The last passage, of course, unambiguously identifies a slave as property. I honestly don't think there is an honest reading of that passage that could interpret it otherwise, although I've seen people try to do so. And just so it's clear that I'm not talking out my backside, if you want a really good example of that, check out some of William Lane Craig's apologetics on the subject. If you want to bear witness to the intellectual and moral depths to which a person will sink in order to defend a position to whose truth and rightness they have a pre-existing commitment. But moving on, of course, for our purposes, we're not concerned with debt slavery. And that passage in Exodus 21 doesn't specify whether the slave in question is a debt slave or a chattel slave. What we are concerned with is chattel slavery and how to go about getting slaves. When you get into taking slaves from other peoples, in which case you're no longer working with a 6-year limit, even with all the workarounds that the Old Testament provides for that, you're in a completely different ballgame. So let's take a look at Leviticus, always a happy book. And this is book 25, verses 44 to 46. "As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly." That is, again, fairly unambiguous approval, endorsement of the issue of taking slaves from among outside one's own group and making them not only property, but inheritable property. I've read a number of cheap-ass apologetics that try to make this go away. Same with the beating within an inch of the slave's life thing, but that's all they are, apologetics. Cheerful old Leviticus goes on to spell out some rules for a priest's slave sharing in food donations to the priest and the conduct and feeding of slaves on the Sabbath. But that's now getting a little wide of the area that I wanted to address for our own immediate historical purposes. But Roger, you might say, that's all the Old Testament, and the New Testament changed everything. And, well, you can actually make that argument, and the argument is often made. As with anything in the Bible, you can pretty much make it say what you want. What the slave owners wanted it to say was something like this, which you find in Ephesians chapter 6, starting at verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling in the singleness of heart as you obey Christ, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Render service with enthusiasm, as to the Lord, and not to men and women, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are slaves or free. And masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them. For you know that you both have the same master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality. Okay, there's a nice argument for equality in heaven after you die. But when this verse was preached from the pulpit to slaves, as it was, that last bit, which is verse 9, was typically left out. It was just, slaves, obey your earthly masters. Or we can take a look at 1 Timothy 6, verses 1 and 2. Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful of them on the ground that they are members of the church. Rather, they must serve them all the more, since those who benefit by their service are believers and beloved. That is, and again, this is a verse that was preached to slaves from the pulpit. If your owner is Christian, you should serve him all the more faithfully. And I'm dwelling on this because this is how the Bible was used. And, well, nowhere does it actually explicitly condemn the institution of slavery. Ever. Or if we take a look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, we have this little bit of advice. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. That is, the Bible enjoins slaves to accept the authority of cruel masters. Or, if you like, we can take a look at Titus, book 2, verses 9 and 10. Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters, and to give satisfaction in every respect. They are not to talk back, not to pilfer, but to show complete and perfect fidelity, so that in everything they may be an ornament to the doctrine of God our Savior. So a book that actually has, in the Old Testament, some 632 capital offenses, including gathering sticks on the Sabbath and a man having sex with another man, never once says, hey, you idiots, stop fucking owning people. So for Christian slaveholding cultures, yes, you can construct an anti-slavery argument out of the Bible. There is no question that you can. But to do that, you have to leave a lot of stuff out and make things say something other than what they actually say. But as I have spent a fair bit of time exploring the various apologetics that people use to justify or try to explain away slavery in the Bible, I have been struck with the degree of intellectual dishonesty involved in trying to make this blemish on that book go away. But not every denomination supported slavery. The mainstream denominations did. Opposition tended to come from dissenting denominations and also from the growing number of voices in the what we might call humanist community. The mainline denominations did, of course, gradually catch on, sometimes due to pressure from without, and sometimes due to the work of thinkers from within. In any case, Britain put an end to the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. What this means is that they banned it, and because they were the most powerful navy in the world at the time, the Atlantic was effectively a British lake. If the British Navy caught anybody sailing a ship full of human beings across the ocean to be sold as property, bad things would happen to the captain. But it took them until 1838 to emancipate people already enslaved within the empire. Nevertheless, by 1838, emancipate them they did, and this, of course, includes the people of Jamaica, one of the oldest British colonies on this side of the Atlantic. As for matters in the United States, which of course we will be discussing next lecture, the Civil War was fought between 1861 and 1865 over the issue of slavery, though revisionists lately like to couch it in the language of states' rights. I've read the primary documents of the rights that they were defending, and mostly it was the right to own people. Again, you've got to be careful with apologists of all stripes. Well, before that war was over, in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which purported to set free, to emancipate, all slaves in the Confederacy, over which Lincoln had no immediate authority at the time because, they were kind of at war with each other. But in 1865, when that little kerfuffle was finally settled with a Union victory, the first of 3 relevant amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment puts an end to involuntary servitude. That is, from 1865 on, under American law, it is illegal to press any person into involuntary servitude. That is, it is illegal to use their body against their will. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed. This extended the right to vote to all adult male citizens being defined in the amendment as of age 21 or older. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment disqualified race as an excuse to deprive a citizen of the right to vote. So those 3 amendments attempt to establish a legal equality between Americans of all races, with the exceptions of First Nations, but that's a special case, and we're not going to go into that today because it's wide of our linguistic context. But okay, that's probably enough historical context for the moment. Why don't we take a look at some specifically linguistic factors that come into play where the Pidgins and Creoles of formerly enslaved peoples are concerned? First, just to refresh your memory, a couple of definitions. While some Creoles are called Pidgins, for our purposes, a Pidgin is understood as follows. It is a simplified version of a language, grammatically and lexically much, much reduced from the language on which it's based. It is context determined. That is, Pidgins exist for purely practical, pragmatic reasons, and the lexicon of any given Pidgin will reflect the context for which it was developed. These are often trade languages with vocabularies useful for transactions of various sorts, but incapable of handling any complexity of thought. In the case of the Pidgins involved in slavery, these would have been basically the bare-bones version of English, or whatever other language, that the slave owners and handlers needed to be able to use with the slaves to tell them what they wanted them to do. And that was about it. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, they didn't want the slaves communicating among themselves. They went to great trouble to make sure they couldn't use their own native languages. So the last thing in the world they were going to do was give them a complete language in which they could communicate what the master's class would have seen as subversive ideas. As for Creoles, which is what we're actually talking about, These tend to have their roots in pidgins, although this is not always the case. When a pidgin starts being the home language of a particular group, it will tend to morph into a Creole. It will pick up more functions, more words, more grammatical complexity, so that it can do more of the job that a complete language would do. Creoles can occur at all levels of society. They can be an acrolect, which is simply a technical term for a prestige dialect. They can be a mesolect, that is a dialect occupying the middle regions of a society or the middle regions of a range of prestige. Or they can be a basilect, a dialect associated with lower prestige and often a lower social class. So, in other words, they're flexible, they get around. The vocabulary of Creoles tends to mostly come from the dominant language. The term for the language from which a Creole takes most of its vocabulary is the lexifier. So, for example, Jamaican Creole, the principal lexifier is English. However, a number of grammatical and idiomatic structures will tend to come in from the substrate, the language that is not dominant, but nonetheless present in the construction of the Creole. And there can be actually any number of substrates in a given Creole. There doesn't just have to be one superstrate and one substrate. There will generally be one superstrate and at least one substrate. There has to be at least one. But there's nothing saying there can't be more than one. And a number of Creoles around the Caribbean, even if we just stick to the English Creoles, show evidence of substrates from not only African languages, but also other European languages, such as, for example, French, Spanish, Portuguese, or Dutch. As for the origins of the various Creoles arising out of the slave trade, there are a few different ideas, as you might expect. One of them is called Monogenesis, and this is the notion that all of the existing Creoles arising from the transatlantic slave trade can actually be traced back to a Portuguese-based pidgin that was spoken among the slave ports from about the 15th century to about the 18th century. The notion here, of course, is that regardless of the native languages of the various peoples who were shipped out from those ports, the trade language of the slave traders themselves, both European and African, would have been this Portuguese-based pidgin, which was basically shipped across the Atlantic with the millions of Africans who moved through those ports over the centuries during which they were operating. And there are, in fact, a great many similarities between the Creoles of formerly enslaved populations in North America and the Caribbean and the Creoles spoken along the coast of West Africa. So there is actually some evidence to support this notion. On the other hand, there is a theory of polygenesis, which, as you might expect, argues that the various Creoles developed independently, arising from their particular contexts, which, of course, often having much in common with each other, would have produced common patterns that don't need to be traced back to a common origin. For example, the English-speaking overseers would have simplified their English when talking to their slaves in probably a relatively narrow variety of ways. And the kinds of things they would have said to their slaves would, by virtue of the nature of the institution of slavery itself and the type of work that they were doing, have had also a fair bit in common, without involving necessarily a common ancestor. And of course, given that the language groups from which the slave population was taken were dispersed across the enslaved population on this side of the Atlantic, similar grammatical structures and similar vocabulary remnants would have been present as well across a wide spectrum of people. And then there's also the fact that our brains arguably process language in fairly predictable ways. That is, the deep structure of language tends to be hardwired into our brains themselves. So, for example, there's going to be no language that doesn't have verbs. There's going to be no language that doesn't have nouns, that kind of thing. Certain categories of word are going to occur. Certain patterns are going to occur. So that there is a lot of commonality between Creoles in various areas can also arguably be, at least in part, attributed to the simple fact that we all have language brains. And the languages we use are, in a very real sense, reflections of the physical structure of our gray matter. Personally, I find that idea really fascinating. Most importantly, I think, for our purposes, a Creole is the language of a living culture. It's not merely a trade language, it's not merely a functional dialect. It's a language in which song, literature, poetry, and any other form of both popular and high culture discourse can be conducted. I will be posting some examples, some YouTube clips to our Moodle page, so that you can give a listen to a few of these, spoken or sung by native speakers of them, which is always the best way to get a sense of a language if you can. As for the current lecture, though, as I am not a native speaker of this or any other Creole, I will have to take a slightly more distanced approach. Those of you who've checked out the Moodle page recently will have noticed that there are a few handouts up now, all of them at the moment pertaining to the Jamaican translation of the New Testament. This is a fascinating piece of writing, by the way. It's quite wonderful in a number of ways. The translation begins with a short essay explaining the importance of having the translation in the first place and providing a linguistic and cultural justification for doing a translation into Jamaican Creole, rather than continuing to rely on one of the standard English translations, which had been the case before the Jamaican translation was made. As I've mentioned a number of times, it matters a great deal whether a dialect or a Creole has a translation of the Bible in it. This is on the one hand an indication that the language is up to meeting the challenges posed by any high culture text, which regardless of belief, the Bible indisputably is. It's also a declaration on the part of the translators that the language is up to meeting those challenges. That is, it's a declaration that the language has come of age, that it has reached full maturity. What I think I'm going to do over the next few slides is, while admitting my own limitations in doing so, read and then say a little bit about the introduction in as close to the intended pronunciation as I can manage. It will be imperfect, of course, because as I said, this is not a dialect in which I'm fluent. But also, I think, and you'll find this as you look at the translation, hearing it even imperfectly will probably help you understand it. It looks far more alien than it is. It also exemplifies a number of the typical characteristics of a Creole. So as a piece of language, as a sample of language, it's very valuable. So just to get things started, let's take a look at the title of the introduction. If you look at it, it looks kind of strange, doesn't it? It sounds something like this. First thing first, before you go into the Jamaican New Testament, the Jamaican language. Now, of course, I massacred that pronunciation probably quite badly, but probably as well as you were listening, the words you were looking at, the spelling, came to make a little bit more sense. So let's talk about a few of the features just of the title. One, first thing first. First things first. This is a wonderful example of an informal expression in standard English being adopted or adapted to a different purpose in Creole. As I've said already, Creoles tend to emerge out of Pidgins, which have quite stripped down vocabularies. One of the strategies that a Creole will employ as it develops is simply taking that stripped down vocabulary and expanding its application, using it in ways that the lexifier language doesn't use it in. So to a speaker of standard English, this is going to sound informal. It's going to sound maybe a little bit, the phrase often is used, like baby talk. But it's not. It's simply a common expression from the lexifier language being adapted to a new purpose. Another thing that you'll notice is that the phonetics of Jamaican are quite different from the phonetics of Standard English. Even just taking a look at that fos ting fos phrase, you'll notice that the consonant cluster, st, from first, has dropped the T. This is common. Many of the consonant clusters from Standard English are reduced to a single consonant in Jamaican. Notice also that thing has become ting. That is, the dental fricative has been replaced with a plosive. Dental fricatives are relatively uncommon, actually, and in all of the Creoles of which I'm aware coming out of the slave trade, the dental fricatives have been lost, usually changed to a plosive. So th becomes t, and th becomes d. You'll notice as well, even just glancing at the title, that the dialect is non-rhotic. So in before, which is before, the R is gone, been replaced with the vowel. Also, the R is gone from first. It's now fos. So that is, the standard rhoticity patterns of North American English are not present. The rhoticity or non-rhoticity of Jamaican is not the same as that of received pronunciation, for example, or of Southern American English. It's its own thing. In Jamaican, for example, the conjunction or would be pronounced R. This is not the case in received pronunciation or in most Southern American dialects. More on that in a few lectures. And finally, you'll notice as well that the spelling is phonetic, which makes sense, doesn't it? Because the spelling of this language emerged from the speaking of the language, so naturally the spelling is going to reflect the way people actually speak. This, of course, is the original purpose of spelling and something from which modern English has diverged quite drastically. So let's continue. I think now we'll just take a look at the first paragraph. And my plan is, by the way, to discuss this little essay during our tutorial on Friday. But the first paragraph goes roughly like this. Oh, and by the way, in live classes, when I'm able to meet my students face to face, I usually try to get students to read the entire thing one sentence at a time, just to see if they can get their mouths wrapped around it. I find most students hesitant to do so. I think perhaps for fear of sounding or appearing racist, because those same students often have little hesitation to attempt, say, Middle English or a Scottish dialect or something like that. So, just to be clear, this is just language. It's just a dialect. It's just a version of English. That's all it is, and that's how I'm speaking about it with you. It's not meant to be a parody, so any mistake I make is honestly made, and there is no intent to portray the language as anything lesser than a fully fledged language deserving of all of the respect accruing to a fully fledged language. In any case, here's the first paragraph. I will try not to massacre it too badly. Jamaican, we most people call Jamaican Creole or patois, a one language we belong to Jamaica. Ayaso it come from. About 2.7 million people live here. And out of all of them people there, in every 100, 85 of them chat Jamaican first before them chat nothing else. So it are them first language. In a country here where we can say have two language, a Jamaican the right side of English. English are the language where the government pick and say for use in a we court, school, and for all them sitting there. We have the two main language them, but we have Wipe a different version of the two of them in a miggle. Some coming more like English than some. And now we'll continue with the second paragraph, saving a few comments I want to make until the entire reading is done, and the bulk of the discussion, as I said, for our conversation on Friday. Jamaican, a one Creole language we take off of English in a some way. Over 300 years now, it come about cause people we chat different language meet up. African people from all over Africa, we talk all kind of different language. Did come Jamaica fi work pon the big sugar farm. Them time there, England did run Jamaica. When we think about Jamaican, we can't forget said Jamaican come about just sake of slave work, and all we did happen when we used to have slave work. So can we think that we they know, whole heap of people put the Creole in a one wrong group. Them call it bad English or mishy-mashy English, when nothing no go so. If you look pon the language the wrong way, they did make the language and the people them we chat it look bad for one long time. But people we study language find say Jamaican people start say Jamaican in a one different way. Now people start say Jamaican a sitting we proud of, and it a part of who we be. Plus them see say Jamaican have use. We can use it if we say whatever we want and it work good. In a 2005, the Jamaican language unit go all over the island and ask people some question. Them find say out of the 1,000 people with them ask, in a every 100, 79 and a half think say Jamaican have everything. We make one language one real language. And so it are one real language for you. Them feel say it can use fi say whatever people want, whatever people a think, whatever them a see or anything where them a think up in a them head, just like any of the world top language them. And the third paragraph. All along, most of the time when we use Jamaican, a talk, sing and them kind of sitting there we use it for, we need to use it fi right. But all that happen with most language. We use language a chat and them sitting there before we write in it. So, though most time a chat we chat and sing in it, that no mean say Adam sitting there one it can do. No language, not about fiongyal use fi chat or sing. The work where Louise Bennett Quavali do, where we love so, plus other work all of them sitting there. Sure, say we can write in the Jamaican language. And that's it. Now, I hope you found that rendition useful if you were following along, trying to read the actual spelling. I think a lot of the words that we encounter here are more clear when spoken than when written, simply because we're unfamiliar with the spelling conventions. That said, and while I do want to have a good conversation about this on Friday in tutorial, I think it might be worthwhile, before I wrap up this little lecture, to take a little bit of a look at some Jamaican grammar. So we'll do that, and then we'll call it a day. Before we move on, though, I will just point out that on the handout, if you haven't seen it yet, I have provided a glossary of difficult terms. This should help with your understanding. And I'd also like to point out that when you look at the argument that's being made in these 3 simple paragraphs, it reads like a manifesto on behalf of the language itself. There's nothing there about the Bible. There's nothing there about religion. This is about language. This is about cultural identity and cultural legitimacy. And when read in that light, it's, I think, a really, really powerful document. Anyway, we'll talk about that Friday, as I said. For now, on with the grammar lesson. Let's start with something simple. Personal pronouns. In the singular, we have me, you, im, or it. And in the plural, we have we, unu, and them. Now, some of these are easily recognizable, and some a little less so. In the first person, for example, we have me as a subject pronoun, not I. Now, me obviously comes from me in English, but I is not used. Me now does that job. So what was formerly an object pronoun in English is now a subject pronoun in Jamaican. You, in the singular, is the same. Sometimes it's spelled just YU, but it's the same word. In the third person, im, it. This obviously comes from him, her, and it. And here as well, with im and these are originally object pronouns in English, and they become subject pronouns in Jamaican. In English, of course, it can be both a subject and an object pronoun, as it can in Jamaican. So, familiar stuff, but with a few significant changes. Okay, let's move to the plural. Here it gets interesting. We is the same. We is a subject pronoun in Standard English, and it's a subject pronoun in Jamaican. But the second person plural pronoun is unu. There is no unu in English. Why is it there? Well, it's there because English has dropped the singular pronoun, thou, and used the plural you in both singular and plural instances. This is confusing for a lot of people, and the Jamaicans solved it by importing a word from the Igbo language of West Africa that indicates the second person plural. That word is unu. So here we have a word from the substrate finding its way into the Creole, filling a really important function that the superstrate language isn't doing. I think that's pretty cool. It also shows that in the slavery period, for a significant amount of time anyways, bits and pieces of the lost ancestral languages were still kicking around in the consciousness of the original slaves' descendants. When we move to the third person plural, we're back on solid English footing with dem coming from them, which again is originally an object pronoun being used as a subject pronoun in Jamaican, with, of course, the fricative th becoming the plosive d, which, as I said, is actually quite common among both the Creoles that we'll be looking at and some other versions of English that we'll be looking at as well. And what this indicates, by the way, is the influence that the sound system, the phonetic system of the substrate language has on the formation of a Creole. While the lexifier tends to be the superstrate, not just the grammar, but also many of the details of pronunciation tend to come in from the substrate or substrates. When we move from pronouns to nouns, we also find some interesting things happening, particularly with the plurals. So let's take a look then at how Jamaican makes plurals. In Standard English, for example, if you have more than one plate, you have plates. And you have more than one baby, you have babies. And you have more than one teacher, you have teachers. That is, we add an S to indicate the plural most of the time. Well, in Jamaican, it's plate dem, baby dem, and teacher dem. This is worth pausing on. The S as a plural marker is gone. So the same form of the word occurs in the singular and in the plural. This, again, is something you might expect of a language developing from a pidgin, developing from a very minimal version of the superstrate language. The plural is therefore indicated by adding dem, which comes from them, as a particle, as a standalone element that serves a purely grammatical function. So plate dem, baby dem, teacher dem. I find this interesting because it shows the adaptability of the language community. They inherited a broken, fragmented, overly simplified version of the language, but simply used the resources they had to fill in all of the functions that the fragmentary version of the language imparted to them was not fulfilling on its own. Now, if we take a look at the next two entries, in Standard English, we would say we have many bananas. In Jamaican, you have nuff banana. So nuff, of course, comes from enough. And you'll find that this actually happens a lot in many Creoles. Words will often be retained, but assigned new meanings and new functions. As far as numbers, 10 boys becomes 10 boy. No S on the end. The number itself is enough to indicate the plural. So the plural system is different from standard English, but perfectly rational, internally consistent, and perfectly functional. When we turn to verbs, specifically verb tenses, the situation gets really interesting. There are 4 verb tenses in Jamaican. There's present, present progressive, past, and past progressive. Any time relation you want to express in Jamaican, you can express with one of those 4 tenses, with the finer points being indicated simply by context, or sometimes by modal verbs. As, for example, the future in modern English is indicated by the modal verb will. In Jamaican, it's indicated with gwain, which comes from going to. But okay, let's just take a look and see how these work. For run, or ron, in Jamaican, we have in the present, miron, yuron, imron, wiron, unuron, demron. All right. Pretty straightforward once you know the pronouns, and you do now. But one thing here to notice, and this is similar to the lack of S's in the plural form of the noun, is that the base form of the verb is constant across all persons and numbers. It's just run, not imrons, imron, which again is not surprising considering the history that lies behind these verb tenses. Well, okay, let's take a look at the present progressive. Mi aron, you aron, im aron, we aron, unu aron, and dem aron. Now, in modern English, of course, we would say, I am running, you are running, he is running, we are running, you are running, they are running. The ing suffix is not used, but rather an a particle is used at the beginning, basically functioning as a prefix. Now, this doesn't come out of nowhere. I haven't addressed this in any of the lectures, but you will have encountered it in the textbook. During the early modern period, the progressive form of the verb was in some flux. Usually it was indicated with the ing suffix, so running, but often also it was indicated with an a prefix. And I think this serves a useful distinction between the present participle, running, and the gerund or verbal noun, running. That is the difference between I am running and running is good for you. Well, the a prefix for the present participle, but not for the gerund, means that in, say, 18th century English, you might have said, not I am running, but I am a running. You're a running, I'm a going. This survives in some folk songs and in some dialects, in current-day English as well. I think that is where the a particle comes from, in the Jamaican present progressive. But okay, let's move into the past. Whereas in standard English, we would say, I ran, you ran, he ran, we ran, you ran, they ran. In Jamaican, it's me enron, you enron, im enron, we enron, unu enron, and dem enron. I don't know where the N particle comes from, but it's the N particle that indicates pastness. And the root form of the verb, again, remains unchanged. The spelling and pronunciation of the root form is constant across all tenses, as well as across all persons and numbers. When we get to the past progressive, it's very logical given the other tenses we've looked at so far. So where in standard English we would say, I was running, you were running, he was running, we were running, you were running, they were running. In Jamaican, it's mi eneron, you eneron, im eneron, we eneron, unu eneron, and dem eneron. Well, ena is simply en from the past tense conjugation with the a from the present progressive conjugation tacked onto it. So ena is a compound particle indicating that the verb is functioning in the past progressive tense. Perfectly logical, perfectly functional, and really very easy to learn. And this system works for pretty much all verbs in Jamaican. Be, of course, is a little weird, but be is weird in most languages. but there's no distinction between a strong and a weak verb, for example. Run in English is a strong verb. Run in Jamaican is treated like any other verb. When we take a look at the other examples that I've given you, just for the sake of having more than one to look at, they are tink and ax for think and ask. The forms, as I said, are identical. Tink is pronounced exactly as you would predict, given that the dental fricative has become a plosive. So think becomes tink. And as for ax, that's a fun one too. A number of dialects of English use ax rather than ask. And this is something that's often mocked. It's often treated as if it's bad English, as if it's a misunderstanding, something only uneducated people do. And that's actually not the case. The verb for to ask in Old English is, well, while askian does occur, axion is actually more common. So ax is a dialectal holdover, actually, from the Old English period that has survived in multiple dialects. And I think that's just worth bearing in mind. For now, though, I should probably stop talking. I don't know how long this lecture is going to end up being, but I have a hunch once I've got it all edited and compiled, it'll be one of the longer ones I've given you folks. For next time, I'm going to continue the story by looking at Gula, which is a Creole spoken by the descendants of slaves in the American South along the Atlantic seaboard. And I'll try to draw together some common ground between that Creole and the Creole that we've been talking about today. I will also, of course, be posting some readings to go along with that lecture. The readings will also be biblical in nature, again, not because I'm trying to get you all to read the Bible, but because, as I've said many times before, that's the most widely translated book in the world, so it's always very easy to find passages that can be compared across different languages or dialects. I hope you've enjoyed your reading week and are feeling a little bit refreshed and ready to dive back into the last few weeks of term. I will try to make it as interesting for you as I possibly can. For the time being, though, bye for now, and thank you very much for listening. Talk soon.